From the Rhodes Centre for International Finance and Economics at Brown University, this is the Rhodes Centre podcast. I'm the Centre Director and your host, Mark Blyth. In 2015, economists Ann Case and Angus Deaton published a paper that revealed something startling for one of the richest countries in the world: an increase in mortality rates in the US amongst middle-aged white men and women between the years of 1999 and 2013. Building on this finding, they published a book in 2020 that aimed to explain that trend, which they attributed to, among other factors, economic stagnation, social isolation, and the opioid crisis. The book, titled Deaths of Despair in the Future of Capitalism, caused a stir inside and outside the field of economics as people tried to make sense of America's economy and society in the Trump years. Deaton won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2015 and was knighted by the Queen of England in 2016. Sir Angus Deaton's latest book is called Economics in America: An Immigrant Economist Explores the Land of Inequality. It takes a broader view of the issues brought up in Deaths of Despair. He explores the pervasiveness of inequality in America and why the field of economics often seems blind to the most pressing issues facing individuals and communities. In this episode, I talk with Sir Angus about the book, how it relates to the Deaths of Despair phenomena, and what the field of economics could do to ask better questions about health, wealth, and inequality. I got a lot from the conversation, and I hope you do too. Sir Angus, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here with a fellow Scotsman.
I want to start by asking you, why did you want to write this book? It's a book about your field, but it's also autobiographical. It combines the two. What was the motivation for writing this book?
Well, I like to kill two birds with one stone. That always seems like an economical thing to do. So it's sort of a portrait of the profession. And it's also true that as I've gotten older, and maybe this is just what happens to grumpy old men, I've become a little more skeptical as to whether, economists have been going in the right direction. And that some of the things that we started with, the more philosophical approaches that characterized, Smith and Ricardo and Marx and, Mill and all the way up to Keynes, have sort of been lost, and that we've really lost something here. And we're taking a too narrow focus of what it means to be an economist, and that too narrow focus may actually be doing harm.
That's actually where I want to kind of end up with the conversation. But to get us there, you do write about where you think economics has also succeeded as well as where it's failed. And one of the most arresting points earlier in the book is when you point out the following regarding the US healthcare system. You write that, quote, if you gave every person in America the Swiss healthcare system, they would get 5 more years of life and a $3,000 check each year. Not only is that an astonishing fact, why do you think it is that no one's listening, or at least they're pretending to be deaf? That's such an obvious payoff for the whole of society. Why is it none of the political classes seem to be able to do anything about this?
Well, they understand it very well. I don't think the lack of understanding is any problem. I would point to one single fact, though, and I talk about this in the book too. For every member of Congress and Senate added together, every lawmaker on Capitol Hill, there are 6 lobbyists from the industry. The people on Capitol Hill need a huge amount of money to get reelected. They spend most of their lives raising money. And healthcare is a very well-funded place where they can help raise money. And, you and I grew up in a country where that sort of thing would send people to jail. Here it's just part of the normal politics. So I think that's what happens. It's indefensible, but it's well defended.
It is a strange thing when you come from, as they call it, back, or over here regarding back there, socialized medicine. The very notion that you could do things like direct advertising of drugs to populations. And that seems to be okay, along with, as you say, the lobbying, etc.
I was just going to say, though, before we get too smug with ourselves, the only other country whose life expectancy is behaving as badly as America is Scotland. Yeah,
that's true. We're long-standing champions on that one, unfortunately. That's been going on for quite some time. Well, one of the other areas you write about in terms of where economics has succeeded, but they were kind of late to the game, a more recent story at least, is inequality. So, of course, Piketty had that blockbuster a decade ago, but prior to that, there was Atkinson, other people you write about. There was a lot of serious work there, but it really wasn't a mainstream thing. Now, when you go to the big economics meetings, a huge selection of panels and topics are about inequality. Why do you think it took economics a long time to really pivot to this as a research area?
Well, for a long time, there wasn't that much happening. So, if you take post-war up until about 1972, there wasn't really much increase in inequality. It was pretty flat. And, my friend and colleague Alan Blinder wrote his PhD thesis on income inequality and its effects on consumption patterns. And he published the results in the Journal of Political Economy, which is one of our top journals. And, couldn't really find anything. And, there's this famous phrase that studying inequality is like watching the grass grow. Right. People get bored with that pretty quickly. The other thing that's happened, I think, is, Piketty and his students have certainly had a big effect here. And, two of his, if you like, disciples or students or people who worked with him, Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckman at Berkeley, have done really sterling work in documenting what's happening to income and wealth inequality in the United States. So I think that's changed quite a bit. On the other hand, there are other kinds of inequality. And in some ways, I wish I'd called this book The Land of Inequalities with an S on the end. And, Americans are very familiar with racial inequality. And that's been a running thread through the country since it began. And, Ann Case and I have been writing about educational inequality and what that seems to matter for mortality rates and so on, with people without a 4-year BA doing pretty badly.
Before we turn to your work with Ann Case on deaths of the pair, which has become justifiably famous, I do want to go a little bit more into the inequality issue. Between the sort of Saez and Zuckman moment and Alan Blinder, there's a big pause in the middle of that. And it's also when macroeconomics in particular had a very sort of, let's say, efficient view of what markets are and how they're put together. Did that have something to do with the blindness towards inequality?
Well, yes, I think so. I mean, partly it wasn't a sort of social problem that was in our faces during that period. There was also one of the dominant schools in economics, the Chicago School, even though it would admit the importance of looking at poverty, it never admitted the importance of inequality. And you can find all sorts of quotes by Stiegler and Friedman and people saying, inequality is natural, we're all different, this is the way the world should be, inequality is not a problem that requires solution, and so on. So, for a long time, that was the dominant view. And you will still hear people saying that today. And, Milton Friedman said we should abolish the estate tax. He thought we should encourage tax havens so that the government wouldn't get enough money to do bad things. And so the libertarian view, those views are still out there. So they're more of a minority than they were.
That does make me think a little bit, though, about a comparative dimension. A few years ago, Pierre-Olivier Gouinchis' partner, who's a sociologist, wrote this wonderful book about economics comparing France and the United Kingdom and the United States, and pointed out that despite it being a global social science, there are distinct national differences. During that kind of period between the golden age up to 75 and into the go-go 90s, when we weren't seeing inequality as a social problem, but it was certainly rising, and we've spoken a little bit about this, there were societies that were dampening down inequality. They weren't necessarily becoming hopelessly inefficient in an Oaken sense, Scandinavia, etc. How did that type of comparative evidence not seem to impact particularly the American view of inequality?
Well, I think Americans are different. And, there is this belief in America that's very strong that it's the land of opportunity, and that land of opportunity doesn't require a safety net. You don't really have to look after people. You don't have to worry too much about the bottom because everybody has this opportunity. That's not clearly in the data, and that social mobility appears to be, if anything, somewhat weaker here than it is in other countries. So that factually seems to be false. On the other hand, people can believe what they want to believe. And there is a sense in which people came here to escape from oppressive governments. It's a very strong line here in the US. And I think it affects a lot of things. One of the reasons why we have a pretend private healthcare system, because people believe they don't really want the government involved in it. And you quoted earlier people saying, that's a socialism, where it's just a sort of policy that many people would approve of. So that's a deep current in America, I think.
I want to turn now to your work with Angus with Deaths of Despair. What turned you on to this? Because it seemed to me, as just a consumer of this literature, there'd been people doing public health and working on this, but no one had grasped the nettle in the way that the two of you managed to and actually bring it to public attention. What was it that sort of turned you on to this and said, oh, hang on, there's something going on here and it's really not quite right?
Pure accident, pure serendipitousness. Also, I think not belonging to the public health community was probably an advantage, and that we came in with fresh eyes. And the concern that dominated much of the public health literature was the difference in mortality rates between blacks and whites. And that's still, the way health equity is often defined. And there was less attention to educational differences. At that time, when we first discovered there was this important group, sort of midlife non-Hispanic whites, for whom their average mortality rate was going up, we thought we must have made an error, because if that were true, if that had been true, then everybody would have known about it. So we spent a lot of time checking our numbers. And secondly, we thought, well, if it's true, someone must have written about it. It's got to be there. And so we did a big literature search. And what was in the literature was a certain amount of rejoicing over the gap between blacks and whites getting smaller, justified happiness over that. But no one seemed to have noticed that part of the contribution to that was not just falling mortality rate among blacks, but rising mortality rates among whites. And we got a lot of pushback. I mean, Anne had people yell at her for saying, how dare you study mortality of whites? This is just not an important problem.
Wow.
So the public health was pretty heavily invested in these racial differences in health. One of the reviews says, nowhere in this book will you find a chart showing black mortality higher than white mortality for all of American history. It's one of the first figures in one of the table, one of the chapters. So, a lot of people approached this work with what you and I would call blinkers and what Americans call blinders. And it was shortly after we published the first piece that the CDC discovered that life expectancy at birth was actually falling and had fallen for a couple of years. So that's changed, but the public health system in this country is very slow to process data. So these things have to be going on for a while before you actually find them.
When you talk about it in the book, you kind of link it to a broader political current that we call populism, MAGAism, Trumpism, etc. It's another symptom in a way of a population that used to be important, or at least important to the economy of the United States, and who are increasingly marginalized, and deaths of despair become, if you will, the reaction to that. Do you see the two of these things as tied together?
Oh, very much so. But just to make it clear, that's an interpretation. It's not something in the data. And a lot of people object to that. They resist our linking of those things, which I agree 100% with what you said. These are people who've lost political power. They used to have unions. They don't really have unions anymore. The unions in Washington, we've talked about lobbying already. The unions in Washington spend less than Alphabet spends. That's all the unions taken together. So there's been a real loss of civic belonging for people without a 4-year degree. And of course, the doctors prohibit foreign workers coming and taking their jobs, whereas the people who work in car factories have to live with that all the time. So there's a real sense in which I think we've maltreated those people, and the educated elite that's been running the country hasn't done a very good job of recognizing the problems. And that takes us back to something we talked about at the beginning. It's not just money. It's the loss of community, it's the loss of work, it's the loss of respectability, if you like, the loss of status, all of these things wrapped up. But as I say, that's the story we're telling, and not everybody buys into that. The alternative story is just an opioid crisis. We're past that now. Of course, the deaths are still going up, but there were some bad pharma and then some bad drug dealers, and once we get this controlled. And the answer we pose to that is, well, societies don't have opioid crises unless there's some deep social malaise going on in the first place.
Going back to where we started, you talked about a narrowness in economics and the need to go back and broaden it. What you called there, I think you said, well, that's just an opinion or an interpretation. Surely that's part of what social scientists and economists in particular should offer, to go, if not beyond the data, then to suggest what the consequences of these data are. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. But several things have happened. In these debates, sometimes the data and the interpretations are muddled. So people say your data are wrong. You did this wrong. So it's good to keep the facts separate from the way you're interpreting them. So that's one thing. The second thing, economics in particular, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, has gotten into this state where it won't accept almost any evidence unless it's done by a randomized controlled trial or it's done by some approximation to a randomized controlled trial. And I understand why that happened. It happened because of dissatisfaction with a lot of empirical results, over the years, in which they just weren't very credible. And so people wanted more credible ways of getting results. And these methods are often seen to be credible. I think they're less credible than they sometimes appear, but they seem very credible, and you can sell them to ordinary people. And the analogy with the medicine cuts a lot of ice, even though I don't think it ought to. But those methods are very good at looking at very small, local, narrow things. And these big questions, like what does immigration do to society? What does overexpensive healthcare do to society? Become essentially unanswerable. And so economists sort of walk away from them. And that's been a problem too. Our stories are much more like the stories that historians tell, and political scientists used to tell before they got bitten by this same bug. And they're to some extent not acceptable in my profession anymore.
But nonetheless, the world seems to want those types of explanations to, help them understand it. One of the places that you point out that, again, economics has been a little bit late to the party is in climate change. And you talk about how most of the work in climate change takes discount rate frameworks as the way to think about it. How much do you value the present versus the past? How much are you willing to pay, etc.? And the question that struck me at that point was, is this actually any type of framework you want in your climate change if you regard it as an existential threat? If you really believe at the end of the day, if this is not solved, everything goes to zero, there's no real discounting on that. You would need an entirely different approach to really understand it. Is that a fair characterization?
A little bit. Maybe I don't really want to defend it. There are certainly economists out there who think that the future more than 1,500 years away is really of no consequence at all. And that's because of the discounting. And economists are certainly very used to that. They also like to use market interest rates as having ethical significance, which I think is an error. On the other hand, if you think about the way the philosophers think about climate change, they do recognize that a lot of climate change is a trade-off between today and tomorrow. And you have to have some terms in doing that trade-off. And I think most of the philosophers would argue that you shouldn't be discounting, or you should be using a zero discount rate. They would accept some discount rates. There's some chance that the Earth is going to be hit by an asteroid. And so if you're about to be hit by an asteroid, I don't know what an asteroid is, a fishy asteroid is.
I like the idea of an oysteroid. I think we should explore it in another conversation.
Right. But if an asteroid is coming for you tomorrow, you should have a pretty good time today and not worry too much about tomorrow. But that apart, there doesn't seem to be much case for discounting. But there are, that's a value judgment, and different people have different value judgments. What I think is not correct is to use the market rate as an indicator of what those trade-offs ought to be, if only because the future generations are not really participating in that market.
Right.
And, if the future generations were participating in that market, you could make a somewhat stronger case.
One quote from halfway through that really struck me here was, at page 95, you said the following, about basically the world that we have built over the past 30 years. In retrospect, it is not so surprising that free markets, or at least free markets with a government that permits and encourages rent-seeking by the rich, should produce not equality, but an extractive elite that predates on the population at large. That's a very strong line and a pretty strong condemnation of where we've ended up. What brought you to that evaluation? Because it's not exactly what we'd expect from a quote-unquote mainstream economist.
I have all the credentials of a mainstream economist, but a lot of economists might tell you I've gone off the rails. That quote I'll justify in a minute, but I would put it in a slide. I found this quote in a book by Andrew Koppelman, who was saying that if you live in a world which has been hollowed out, or in an economy that's been hollowed out, where the state allows gigantic behemoths, whether you call them trusts or big tech or something. So you've got this very imperfect world, which is the US healthcare system would be an example of it. Then you apply libertarian rhetoric to that. All you're really doing is licensing the plunder, as it were, because you say, well, the healthcare system may be extracting a lot of money. It shouldn't be extracting, but that's what free markets do, and we believe in free markets. And that's a terrible concatenation of things, because it's just licensing this plunder. So why do I think, well, if you read a lot about opioids and see what Purdue Pharmaceutical did.
Yeah.
And I've thought more widely about that, which is addiction. Addiction is something that we ought to think very hard about letting corporations do to people, because you can make a lot of money by selling addictive drugs, and drug dealers have done that for a long time. Purdue Pharmaceutical discovered that too, but it's all around us. And there are these court cases that were just announced the other day against Meta for selling addictive social media to kids.
Yeah.
The other thing in America now is you can't watch a sports game without being assaulted by betting companies. And it drives me nuts because they're saying bet, the first bet's fee, all this promised thing. And then on the bottom it says, if you have a problem with gambling, call this number. And it's sort of like, you wouldn't have a problem with gambling if you weren't being assaulted by these companies. And that's something that state governments have done. After the Supreme Court said state governments couldn't prohibit it, they actually went ahead and licensed it in many states, so it's not in all states. Cigarettes are another obvious example. And our public policy on that has been to sort of bolt the door with lawsuits after the horse has bolted. So telephones, cigarettes, alcohol.
Yeah.
There are huge numbers of people dying of alcohol poisoning. These are very profitable for firms because once they get you hooked, they don't have to advertise anymore. You just come begging for more.
You would think that economics would be a little bit more ahead of the curve on this one, though, because if I take that as a literal description of our world, if I was Schumpeter, I'd be appalled. Because you can't have creative destruction. You don't really have to do innovation. You really are just, as he called it, the stationary state firm, and you sit back and then you just pull in the pennies, which is not where you want to be. This is not why we embrace capitalism and free markets. In fact, it's a real perversion of it.
Well, the big tech companies are not all that old. And you could argue there was a lot of creative destruction when they got started. And
Right.
The problem with creative destruction is that, the people who win round one then turn around and try to stop anyone else winning round two. And I think it's
Right.
very important that the antitrust authorities do something about that. So that's another thing, which I think it's there in economics. It's just we've sort of turned a blind eye to it over the past 30, 40 years. I think we think there's a lot more monopsony in labor markets than we used to think, so that workers are being exploited. And that gives you a good story as to why increasing minimum wages just redistributes income from profits to workers. And is generally a good thing because it's correcting a market failure rather than introducing one. So there's lots of things like that where I think we've messed around with other things and taken our eye off the ball, or off one very important ball.
Close to the end of the book, I think it's the penultimate chapter, you directly address, did economists essentially cause the financial crisis? What's your take home on that? Should they be in the dock? Are they guilty? To be Scottish, is the case not proven?
Well, I'm sure Larry Summers would say the case was not proven, but I've never accused them of being the only players in this by any manner of means. And I think the influence of Chicago economics was very strong, and not just on the right. If it was just one party and the other political party was, on board with the unions and trying to break the pie a little more evenly, then that would be better than it's been. And so you get all sorts of people economists who worked for democratic administrations, who were completely convinced that the power of the market, you didn't have to do too much because the market look after itself. And actually, I don't want to harp on Larry Summers, who I admire enormously, and I think the book makes that clear. He wrote on a piece in the New York Times after Milton Friedman died, which had these famous words, "We're all Friedmanites now." And this was written about a year before Lehman Brothers crashed. And it said one of the many things that Friedman taught us was that modern banking is safe and we don't need to do the regulations and so on. We don't need capital controls. That was after the Asian financial crisis and after the IMF had changed its mind and was messing around. So I don't know. I think the IMF has changed more rapidly than the rest of the profession. I got an invitation to go and talk about this book down there in a couple of weeks. And I said to them, "Do you know what's in the book?" And they say, "Yes, we know exactly what's in the book. Why do you think you're inviting you to come and talk about it?" So that's a real change. It's also true that major important politicians have been very much on board with the deaths of despair story. So that Janet Yellen, who we've known forever, promoted this, gave us talking slots, talked about it herself. Christine Lagarde, when she was at the IMF, was very enthusiastic and very supportive too. So the world is changing, I think.
It takes time, but you can pivot the battleship eventually.
Right. Takes a long time.
To close it out then, it's been a great conversation, but I want to go back to the deaths of despair, but also to juxtapose it to a discussion that you have running through about how you used to think as a kind of cosmopolitan, the welfare of all was important as the welfare of basically, your own nationals. And you've become, I don't want to say more nationalistic, but less cosmopolitan. You're also a little bit more critical, you used the words earlier on, of the elite that runs the country, of meritocracy. So there's two things going on, which is, if you don't have a college degree, you're in trouble, which implies a kind of meritocracy. And then on the other hand, but at the same time, the system's rigged, and I'm kind of not really buying that anymore. How do we live with these two points, shall we say?
Well, the system rigged, and I think the meritocracy is extremely corrosive. And we were certainly influenced by Michael Sandel, political scientist at Harvard. His story, just like what you said, essentially, that, the educated elite are sort of self-satisfied because they did it all for themselves. And they think the people who are not so educated, blew their chances, as it were. And the less educated, think the game is rigged. And they have a sneaking suspicion that the condescenders from above may be right. And they actually did blow it. That's a very unstable political situation because people get very angry and they're going to try to pull that house down. So for me, that's the real present danger today. We've built an economy of political structure in which these people have very little. And it's not just material. The material has not been doing very well either, but it's the huge number of people who are dying and are profiting out of that. The cosmopolitan versus national, I'm still a cosmopolitan. I certainly believe, as I'm sure you do. I'm very fond of Scotland in particular. I grew up there. I think if Scotland ceased to exist or was somehow sucked into a United States of the world, That would be a great loss, not just to me personally, but to something more intangible than that. What I attack in the book is this idea that there's no special status given to the place where you live. And that, I think, is something that economists and many political scientists, too, who argue against any ethical significance of national boundaries.
Yeah.
And, of course, national boundaries really do have ethical significance. I mean, we live here. We're locked in contracts with one another. We provide insurance systems for another. We provide social security. We have to obey the laws. There's all that sort of stuff in which we're locked together with these other people, even if we would have chosen not to, which actually you and I did choose to join this.
But we also chose to join another community. We still accept those, if you will, responsibilities.
That's exactly right. And so, even if you don't feel warmer towards the people in your nation, you have those responsibilities, whether you really like them or not. And that has to count for something. And also, you want to be careful about how you treat those people, because if they feel the system's rigged against them, they stop believing in democracy, because what's it done for them recently? And, everything, including, you're not going to be doing much, in the way of foreign aid if the people at home are coming at you with pitchforks.
Indeed. Perhaps then the coda on the whole thing is that economics may be changing, but it needs to remember history and it needs to remember sociology.
Absolutely. And philosophy. What makes people tick is not just money. And philosophers have always known that. And economists, I think, have sort of forgotten.
With that, it's been great to talk to you, Sir Angus. A real pleasure. I really enjoyed the book. I hope tons of people read it, and I hope many listen to this podcast too.
I hope so too. Thank you very much, Mark. It's been a lot of fun talking to you.
This episode of the Rhodes Centre podcast was produced by Dan Richards and Zach Hirsch. If you like the show, leave us a rating and review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you haven't subscribed to the show already, please do that too. You can learn more about what we covered in this episode and the other podcasts from the Watson Institute at Brown University by following the links in our show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode of the Rhodes Centre podcast. Thanks.